Well, I mean, this is like I think I said the day they put me in here that this was, for a country singer and songwriter, it's just top of the mountain.
Alan Jackson was more than a voice. He was the heart of real country music, with George Strait as the king and head. From the slow roads of Newnan, Georgia, to the halls of Nashville, his story was one of courage, grace, and gospel truth. Behind his rise to legend was a struggle few ever knew. Join us as we take you through a story that George Strait revealed at 73, the truth the world never saw coming. Who was Alan Jackson? Long before he ever played a guitar in front of thousands, Alan Jackson was simply a quiet boy who had sandy blonde hair. He was born on the 17th of October, 1958, in the small town of Newnan, Georgia. Alan Eugene Jackson was the youngest of the 5 children his parents had. He lived in a one-story home that was built around his grandfather's tool shed, which was also a space that doubled as his parents' bedroom, and gives us a glimpse into the modest beginnings from which he rose. His father, Joseph Eugene Jackson, worked as a mechanic at one of Ford's plants, while his mother, Ruth Music Jackson, was a devout Christian who instilled in Alan a deep love for gospel music. The family had little in terms of wealth, yet they were comfortable. When it came to love, discipline, and Southern morals, they were at the top of the list. It was in that old shed, which had been converted into a bedroom, that Alan began to dream. At the age of 12, he discovered gospel quartets and old country vinyl records, and with that music, it became his second language. He didn't grow up in a house filled with musicians, nor did he receive formal music training. His early ambition was far from the spotlight. He worked at a shoe store, fixed cars, and performed odd jobs that helped support his family. It wasn't until his wife, Denise, who was also his high school sweetheart, gave him a demo tape and encouraged him to pursue a music career, specifically in Nashville, that the idea of music as a career stopped being a fantasy and began to take shape. Alan didn't move to Tennessee with a record deal or an inside connection. He had none of those, yet he and Denise packed up and relocated with nothing but faith and the belief that if he could just get his foot in the door, his voice would do the rest. That voice was one many called rich, smooth, and soaked in the soul of old-time country music, and that voice one day echoed through every major country stage in America. However, before the platinum records, the CMA awards, and the sold-out tours, Alan Jackson was just a boy from Georgia who had nothing but dirt under his fingernails, a notebook full of lyrics, and a dream that refused to quit. Even then, those who reportedly met him described him as kind, humble, and unusually reserved. Newnan, Georgia, in the heart of Coweta County, where the air has reportedly smelled of pine and the streets moved slowly, wasn't just a place, but also a way of life. Growing up in a family that struggled to make ends meet meant that Alan had learned the importance of hard work, gratitude, and humility at a very tender age. Their house, which was built around an old tool shed, wasn't big enough for a family of 7, but it was manageable. He didn't get spoiled by his parents with toys or vacations like most kids did while growing up. Instead, they provided him with structure, scripture, and helped him develop his patience. Sundays were for church, while afternoons were for chores, and at night, Alan would reportedly sit quietly and listen to his mother's records. Records from people like the Louvin brothers, Hank Williams, and the Statler brothers were his company. In school, Alan was reportedly quiet and observant, but he wasn't the loudest in the room. When he did speak, people always listened to him. Sources say that he had a way of always drawing you in without trying to. His classmates have reportedly remembered him as polite, soft-spoken, and kind to a fault. He wasn't the type to seek attention or popularity, but he was the type you would remember years later. At age 15, Alan was said to have gotten his first job working at a local shoe store. Not long after, he moved on to work as a forklift operator, then as a construction worker, and even drove a delivery truck. However, none of these roles made him rich. Meanwhile, his passion for music continued to grow beneath the surface. By the time he was in his early 20s, it was clear that he didn't just admire country music. He had lived it growing up and continued to live it. This deep and sacred connection to his roots became the defining quality of his sound. It made his sound authentic, raw, and unapologetically country. From dreams to reality.
Was I who made love and then you cried? Remember when?
Alan Jackson's journey from Newnan to Nashville wasn't fast, as most people think, because having a captivating voice didn't mean success came immediately after he started. His journey was instead one that was well thought out, brave, and filled with faith. Before his name was written in country music history, he was just a man who had a guitar, a handful of songs, with faith and a belief that the world still needed the kind of music he grew up with, the kind that was pure, plain-spoken, and unapologetically country. His turning point came in the early 1980s, shortly after he married Denise, his high school sweetheart. While Alan worked odd jobs to make ends meet, Denise stood as a rock behind him, holding him up as his greatest believer. Fate gave Denise an unexpected encounter with Glenn Campbell, whom she met while working as a flight attendant. Denise was bold enough to hand off one of Alan's demo tapes. That single act of courage led to a small opportunity that changed his life. It was an opportunity to sign a publishing deal with Campbell's music company. However, Nashville wasn't easy, because others had taken the same path before Alan and were waiting for results. Alan spent years writing songs for others before anyone gave him a microphone of his own. He studied the business, watched closely while learning from those who came before him, and used those experiences to refine his voice, not just vocally, but as an artist in general. He wasn't interested in following the trends like others did because he wanted to preserve a sound that was slipping away in the age of pop country crossovers. In 1989, his moment finally came when he signed with Arista Records as their first country artist. The following year, he released his first album titled Here in the Real World. This was an album that didn't just announce his arrival, it also declared his mission. Songs like Wanted, Chasing That Neon Rainbow, and the title track resonated with everyday Americans. From there, Alan Jackson became a force to be reckoned with. His blend of neo-traditional country, heartfelt lyrics, and a no-nonsense approach to presentation made him stand out. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't chase headlines. He was known to wear a white cowboy hat, playing his guitar, and singing like someone who knew exactly who he was. By the mid-90s, he had become a fixture in every country's household. He wasn't just singing hits, he was also shaping the genre one step at a time. Songs like Don't Rock the Jukebox, Midnight in Montgomery, and Gone Country were more than songs that topped charts. They were cultural markers. He won CMA and ACM awards, earned multi-platinum albums, and became a member of the Grand Ole Opry. Nonetheless, through it all, he remained unchanged, soft-spoken, and stayed grounded, all while writing songs about simple lives and sacred moments. He had gone from a tool shed in Georgia to the stages of the world, not because he was chasing fame, but because he stayed true to the truths that built him. In doing so, Alan Jackson didn't just become famous. He became authentic and remained true to himself in an industry often swayed by trends. Hits, honors, and Hall of Fame moments. By the time Alan Jackson entered his third decade in country music, he had become more than a singer. He had become a symbol, a carrier of tradition. He was a quiet rebel who proved that staying true to your roots was not only possible, but also powerful. His career wasn't just a decorated one anymore, it had become legendary. With more than 60 singles that landed on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart, while 35 of them made it to the #1 spot, Alan's discography shows a masterclass in Southern storytelling. From the honky-tonk swagger of Don't Rock the Jukebox to the tender touch of Remember When, he captured the emotional spectrum of everyday life, from heartbreak to joy, faith, and memory. One of his most profound moments came in the September 11th attacks. His reflective ballad, Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning, offered a nation that was mourning a voice of calm. Without anger or politics in his tone, he asked a simple question that echoed in the hearts of millions. That single song got him a Grammy Award, the CMA's Single of the Year Award, and perhaps most importantly, the respect of a grieving country. Yet Alan's real power was not just in writing songs that topped charts, but in his commitment to the roots of country music. As the industry began to move into pop influences and flashy productions, Alan remained the same. He stayed loyal to his steel guitars, fiddle solos, and stories that reflected real life. His devotion to the genre did not go unnoticed. Over the years, he gathered an impressive collection of awards. He won 2 Grammy Awards, 16 Country Music Association Awards, including 3 Entertainer of the Year titles, and 17 Academy of Country Music Awards. He became a member of the Grand Ole Opry in 1991 and was honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The height of his recognition came in 2017 when Alan Jackson was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Standing alongside the very legends he once listened to as a child, he fought back tears as he delivered a humble reflection. I've lived the American dream. That moment wasn't just a celebration of his achievements, it was also a validation of his journey thus far. Through humility, faith, and with an unshakable identity, Alan Jackson didn't just influence the genre, he safeguarded it. Yet, even with the bright lights and thunderous rounds of applause he got, some stories were unfolding behind the scenes. Unfolding away from the microphones and awards, Alan had shared something quiet but powerful with another country titan, George Strait. It was there, in the space between two legends, that something deeper began to take shape. The beginning of Alan and George. Their names were already written in the heart of country music, and this was long before they stood side by side. George Strait was crowned the King of Country, and Alan Jackson, the quiet outlaw of tradition. For all their fame and accolades, the story of how their paths truly crossed was more about mutual respect than headlines. Their meeting wasn't arranged for cameras or engineered by record labels to increase their time in the spotlight. It was simpler than that. It was two men drawn together by their love for the same thing, and that was real country music. When they first spoke backstage at an industry event in the early 90s, witnesses say it was like two old souls recognizing one another. George, who was already a legend in his own right, was reportedly said to have seen something familiar in Alan, a hunger to keep things country, no matter how fast the genre tried to run from its roots. Alan, on the other hand, saw George as the blueprint for building a long, unshakable career without losing oneself in an industry where others chased trends. George held his ground, which allowed Alan to do the same. In George, he found a kindred spirit. Their bond deepened when they performed together at the CMA Awards in 1999, a duet of George Jones's Choices. That performance wasn't just a tribute, it was a statement. At a time when radio was brushing aside older legends, George and Alan stood tall for the traditionalists. Two of the biggest names in modern country had just thrown down a respectful, melodic protest. What began as professional admiration evolved into a private friendship rooted in honesty and mutual understanding. They reportedly kept in touch, checked in, shared thoughts about the industry they loved, and quietly hated at times. In an industry often driven by competition, flashy reinvention, and commercial urgency, the bond between Alan Jackson and George Strait stood out like an old country hymn played on vinyl, warm, worn, and deeply real. Over the years, their paths often crossed on stage, at awards shows, and in dressing rooms far from the cameras. However, even in silence, the connection was obvious. They didn't need to say much because they understood the weight of what they carried and the burden of being leaders to a vanishing kind of country music and the responsibility of staying true to it when others bowed to changing tides. George Strait, who was known for his tightly curated private life, let few people in, and Alan was one of the rare few who gained access to that guarded space. They shared memories, music, and worries about the industry aging, and how long they could keep going before their bodies or the business told them to stop. It was during these quiet meetings that George reportedly began to notice something that others didn't. He noticed that Alan moved more slowly backstage, saw how he leaned against walls more often, and how sometimes his hands trembled when tuning his guitar. Alan, who was always humble to a fault, brushed it off by saying, "Just getting old, man." George knew it was more because he saw through the humor. He saw the pain beneath it. However, out of respect for Alan, he reportedly refrained from pressing. That was reportedly the unspoken rule between them. The truth could be shared, but only when the other was ready. Their friendship was genuine, not for show, as there were no splashy social media posts or coordinated duets meant to boost sales. What they had was rare, a bond that was built not in spectacle, but in shared values, private conversations, and mutual protection. It was that quiet bond that became a sacred brotherhood, that later became the reason George carried a truth that wasn't his to tell, a truth he kept close to the chest for years. What George Strait witnessed in silence. As the years passed slowly and Alan Jackson continued to grace stages across the country, few noticed the subtle change in his presence. Of course, his voice remained golden, and songs still touched many hearts. But behind the curtain, something about him was quietly changing. George Strait noticed it because he was looking closely, not as a fan or fellow performer, but as a brother. George had long admired Alan's commitment to staying grounded, but now he began to admire something else, and that was Alan's resilience. During backstage moments, he noticed the tiredness that came with 2 hours on set, the slight tremor that appeared when Alan stood too long, and the way he carefully moved from chair to stage. These were not signs of aging alone. Something else was wrong. George could see signs of struggle. Alan confided in him sparingly. That was his way of doing things, and from their conversations, George knew that he had never wanted sympathy. He reportedly once told George, during a quiet moment after a show, "It's getting harder to stand still, much less dance around. I feel like I'm betraying the music if I sit down." He laughed when he said it, but George didn't, because he wanted to know what was wrong with the one he called his brother in the industry. Eventually, the name was spoken: Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. It was a degenerative nerve condition that Alan had been living with in secret for years. It had affected his balance, coordination, and strength. For most icons, it would have meant early retirement. However, Alan kept singing, kept touring, kept showing up for the fans who had built their lives around his voice, which was no easy feat in a condition like that, but Alan made it possible. George didn't tell anyone, not his band or the press. Not even his closest friends in the industry were aware of it. He kept the truth locked away, honoring Alan's wishes and understanding the dignity of fighting a private battle in a public world. At award shows, when Alan accepted trophies with that soft smile and minimal fanfare, George knew the price he paid just to stand upright on that stage. During shows, when Alan leaned slightly against the mic stand or adjusted his weight carefully so he wouldn't fall, George saw the tiredness that many people mistook for calm because he knew better. He watched as his friend endured the pain he felt, while the world celebrated the music he sang, unaware of the quiet war behind it. Every time Alan walked off stage, covered with sweat but refusing to complain, George Strait's respect for him deepened. He carried all of this in silence, out of loyalty and respect for Alan. George believed that sometimes the deepest kind of love a man can show is to protect another man's truth until he's ready to speak it himself. A promise made in the shadows. One night after a show in Dallas, where the crowd had roared for Alan with thunderous rounds of applause as always, while unaware that backstage he had nearly collapsed into his chair, George was there, waiting with his arms crossed, watching his friend push through yet another performance like nothing was wrong. When the applause faded and the room had been cleared out, Alan turned to George with a smile that didn't just look fake, but felt fake to George. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," Alan admitted. This time, his voice was lower than usual. George reportedly sat beside him without a word for a long moment. Just then, in that quiet moment where only the truth lives, Alan reportedly made a request that was not loud, not dramatic, and just real. "If it ever gets to the point where I can't tell people why I stopped, I need you to tell them for me." George didn't answer right away because he didn't need to. What Alan was asking for wasn't a casual favor. It was the handing over of his unspoken truth. A truth he was now entrusting George with the responsibility of someday explaining why a man who loved country music with everything in him had to walk away. From that night on, George carried that weight with him through every award show, every shared moment backstage, and every photograph that showed Alan smiling while he quietly battled the limits of his body. He carried it through Alan's Last Call tour, through the official statements that only scratched the surface, through the praise that never acknowledged the price behind the perseverance. It was a vow that was made between two men who spoke a few words, but meant every one of those words. Years passed, and Alan kept singing, while George kept watching. The world kept wondering why a man like Alan, who was in his prime, would start pulling back from the stage. The answer to that question was known only to George, and when the time came, the time when Alan finally closed his tour with that bittersweet show in Milwaukee, George knew what he had to do because he had held the truth for long enough. The letter that broke George Strait's silence. It arrived in a plain envelope, handwritten, no fanfare. Just George's name was written in neat cursive across the front. Inside the envelope was a single page with no date, no signature, just words that read like both a farewell and a release. Alan had written it, maybe weeks earlier, maybe months. No one would ever know now because he never said. However, in those lines was everything George had been waiting for years. It was permission, closure, and truth. I've done all I can. I didn't want people to remember me on a stool, wobbling through lyrics I used to belt out standing tall. That's not the Alan they deserve. That's not the music I gave them. I just wanted to walk away while I could still walk away. George read it more than once. The words were simple, but each sentence hit George like a final chord at the end of a song. Alan didn't want a press conference because he didn't want pity. He only wanted his brother in arms to carry out what they had agreed to in Dallas all those years ago. So George carried out what was agreed upon. At a small industry gathering in Nashville, George stood before a room full of his peers, press, and longtime fans. And in his hand was the letter which he held up, not just to show it, but also to acknowledge it before he said, "There's been talk, a lot of guesses, about why Alan's stepping back. Today I'm here to tell you, it's not because he ran out of music, but because he gave you all he had, every note, every lyric, and every inch of strength he had, and now he's earned the right to rest." There were no theatrics, and most importantly, no staged tears. It was just George, speaking in a low and steady manner, the same way Alan had always sung. He explained the illness, followed by the years of silent endurance. He went on to explain Alan's decision to perform through pain rather than explain it. He paused once to clear his throat and added, "He didn't want y'all to worry, but he did want you to know. Not because he's done, but because he did it right." That moment broke something open, not just in George, but in the crowd. It wasn't just the end of an era, it was a revelation. Now the fans finally saw the cost of the country gold they'd been gifted for so long. And the man behind the music was no longer a mystery, he was a hero. The truth finally told. George Strait had always been a man of few words and a figure of quiet power in a genre that was often filled with noise. However, when he turned 73, something in him changed. Maybe it was age, or maybe it was the weight of the promise he had kept all those years, or maybe it was just time. Nonetheless, whatever the reason, George decided to speak, not as a country legend this time, but as a friend honoring another. In a televised interview that aired on a warm spring evening, George leaned back in his chair, with his eyes steady, voice unwavering, and for the first time, he told the world everything. He spoke about all the years he had to watch Alan fight through a disease that slowly robbed him. He recalled moments when Alan could barely walk from the dressing room to the stage, but still went out with a smile on his face. He explained how Alan would downplay the severity of the disease, always saying, "I'll be fine, just give me a little time," even when that time was running out. The interviewer asked George why he had waited this long before talking. George just nodded slightly before responding, "Because it wasn't my story to tell. Not until now." He talked about that letter, yes, the one Alan left him, like a baton being passed from the first lap to the final lap of a relay race. He described how hard it was to stay quiet, also adding that he had many times wanted to speak up, but had held back out of love and loyalty. Then came the part that hit everyone hardest. George looked into the camera and said, "Alan didn't want to be remembered for his illness. He wanted to be remembered for the way he made people feel, for the way his music made life a little softer, a little stronger. So that's how I'll remember him, and that's how we all should." There was silence, and in that silence, the truth hit with more weight than any standing ovation ever could. George Strait, at 73, had finally done what his brother had asked of him years ago. He had opened the door to understanding, not mourning, and in doing so, he gave fans a chance to see Alan Jackson not as the man who stepped away from the stage, but as the giant who had stood on it, quietly carrying more than any of us ever knew. It wasn't a concert, as some might call it. It wasn't a farewell tour like others of his status would have done. It was a private gathering at the Ryman Auditorium, a gathering of just family, a few close friends, and the handful of artists who truly knew what Alan Jackson meant to country music. Alan didn't sing that night. Instead, he sat with Denise by his side, with his hands folded. George Strait stepped forward. He didn't wear a rhinestone jacket or anything flashy, just jeans, boots, and the same white cowboy hat that had become as iconic as his voice. He took a deep breath, nodded once toward Alan, and strummed the opening chords of "Remember When." It wasn't his song, but that was the point. George played it slow, allowing each word to echo in the silence. When the song ended, George set down his guitar and walked off stage without a word. There was no encore, no speeches, just respect for a man who had dedicated his life to the industry, even in his last days. That night wasn't the end of Alan Jackson's story, but it was the final bow of a man who had lived, never deviating from his background. In the stillness that followed, George Strait too seemed to find his kind of peace. One friend honors another, one king tipping his hat to the other. In that quiet room, two legends said goodbye, the only way they knew how, and that was with music, grace, and more heart than any words could hold. What do you think about the life Alan Jackson lived, his bond with George Strait, and how George Strait handled the truth? share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to share this video, like it, and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, click on the other videos displayed on your screen.